Well, welcome everybody to our, I guess this is what, our 7th Train the Trainer refresher office hours, which is a little confusing because today we're actually going to be talking about module 6. But if you recall, modules 5.1 and 5.2 are broken into 2. So this will be our 7th session, but today we're going to be talking about module 6. And let me switch the slide here. Just have a couple housekeeping items to go through before we get started. So everyone for now is on mute. This is a meeting, so we will have the opportunity, or you will have the opportunity to unmute yourself once we get to the question and answer session. There will be time for that at the end. I'm going to go into the slides for module 6, which for anybody who's delivered this particular module knows that there are a lot of slides in this particular module. So I am going to go fairly quickly, but I am planning to leave time at the end so that we can have discussion. That discussion is not going to be recorded. So Connie is recording this meeting right now for those of you who are watching this at a later time. And then at the end of the presentation, she'll actually cut that recording off so that we can all chat and you can ask your questions openly. We will also be posting this on our website. All of the previous modules are available on our website to watch, which I think is a great resource for you going forward, especially if you're preparing for any upcoming winter PSA grower training. So do check those out. The overall purpose of this series is really to review some of the high-level critical concepts from each module, share some recent FDA updates since maybe you've attended a PSA Train the Trainer course a while ago, or you've attended a grower training a while ago. We do plan to cover some timely updates. And then we're also going to focus on presenting this content remotely, because as many of you are in the same position as the PSA team, we're not hosting many in-person trainings at this point in time because of the pandemic. So we will try to highlight, or I will try to highlight, some key tips for delivering this in a remote setting, for example, through Zoom like we're on now, or Adobe Connect, or some other type of online platform. And you'll probably get the most out of this presentation if you are a PSA trainer or lead trainer, but if you're not, that's perfectly fine too. We just want to make it clear that this content is not going to result in getting the PSA Train the Trainer certificate. So even if you go back and watch all the previous sessions, you really have to actually attend a PSA Train the Trainer course in order to be eligible for the Train the Trainer course certificate. And lastly, I just wanted to remind everybody that these slides are copyrighted and cannot be published electronically without express permission of Cornell, or sold in whole or in part by a third party or company for profit. So with that, I think we'll get into the meat and potatoes of module 6 here. And unlike most of the other modules within the curriculum, module 6 really spans multiple subparts of the produce safety rules. So if you think about module 5, you're really only talking about subpart E. But in this particular module, we're talking primarily about subpart K and L, which covers post-harvest handling and sanitation practices. Module 6 also covers broader territory than just the PSR requirements. You'll notice in the flow of this module that we're going to get into some things that actually aren't PSR requirements. So talking about chemical and physical hazards, that's where that content sort of fits into the broader scheme of food safety. As with all previous modules, if you've attended any of these sessions, I think we've really tried to hammer home the fact that there is a flow that every one of these modules follows. And we start out by assessing the risks, then move on to implementing and monitoring practices, moving on to corrective actions, and then lastly, we'll get into the record keeping. So each one of those sections is divided up into what I would consider this particular roadmap, which is actually quite a long roadmap, because as I mentioned before this meeting started, this is one of the longest, this is the longest module. I think there are 41 slides in this particular module. So even before you get into delivering this, if you are the one that's assigned to give module 6, I would highly recommend that you get to know who your audience is, because there are several optional slides that you can potentially cut out of this presentation and save yourself some time and really cover the content that's meaningful to your audience. So timing really is everything. And for those of you who end up delivering Module 7, you know that it really, really stinks to be that Module 7 person who has 20 minutes to deliver their module before the training is over. And this Module 6 is one place you can really blow your timeline if you spend too much time on every one of the slides. So I encourage you, as I'm going through this roadmap, for you to think about who your audience might be, which of those particular slides is going to be the most relevant to them. And then you need to think about, even before you're delivering this, what you would consider your, I think we've been calling them our fireworks slides, or, the slides that you really want to spend some good time discussing with your particular audience. But for the roadmap, when you're looking at the manual, and I encourage everybody, if you don't have your manual in front of you, I'm working off of the PSA Grower Training version 1.2. So I would encourage you to get out your manual, just because this roadmap will make a lot more sense if you're kind of marking it up and flipping through. But slides 4 through 6 are really the warm-up slides. This is where you're just getting them introduced to the topic, what we're going to go through throughout the rest of the module, and then move into a section talking more about what are the hazards in the post-harvest environment. That moves on to a more broad discussion of cleaning and sanitation practices to address those hazards. And then once you get to slide 22, that's where we're really getting more into the nitty-gritty details. We're talking more about sanitary design. We're talking about surface materials, getting way more in depth into that content, whereas slide 16 through 21 really are broader picture cleaning and sanitation practices. And then at the end of the module is where we introduce those food safety hazards, such as chemical and physical hazards, that prior to this, the curriculum really is based on biological hazards, and that's because the produce safety rule focuses on biological hazards. But we all know, if you've been doing trainings for a long time or in the food safety world, there are other types of hazards that are out there that could be present, especially in the post-harvest environment. And then finally, as usual, we'll wrap up with some corrective actions, record keeping, and the wrap up. So you might be wondering why I have this very cute child that looks to be taking his first steps. But slides 4 and 5 in this particular module, I would consider as my baby step slides. So what you're really trying to do is making this an opportunity to plug that this whole thing is about steady progress. So you wouldn't rely on having all of this done overnight. You wouldn't expect a packing house who hasn't done anything in 50 years to magically look like it had been cleaned by Cinderella the next day. So these things really are a progression, and you need to make it clear that even though this module can be overwhelming for growers, there is a great opportunity for them to incorporate these bits and pieces slowly and make sure it works within their particular workflow. And this can help, alleviate some of the anxiety that growers might experience, just breaking it down. Things like, talking about packing and picking containers, hands and clothing, really basic practices that they should be aware of. And then moving them from these basic concepts into a more complex 4-step cleaning and sanitation process. And again, I emphasize that this is going to be a progression for most growers, and it is definitely not something that happens overnight. Later in this module, when we discuss some of the specific examples, such as carpeting in packing houses or wood bins, it's important to discuss why these particular practices can present risks, and then how they can move to a lower risk practice or a lower risk food contact surface, even if it's not the perfect solution. We recognize, and you as trainers need to recognize, that growers are going to be, some growers, I would say most growers, are going to be limited on time and money and might not be able to invest in stainless steel or fancy surfaces. So the focus should really be placed on guiding them to lower risk options and then providing them information on why those practices are warranted and the science on why we're suggesting those particular things. But again, It's moving from these basic concepts into more complex concepts, such as the 4-step cleaning and sanitation protocols. When you get to Module 6, this really is just a reminder. Most of this content was already covered in Module 2, so it's just an opportunity for you as trainers to reinforce it. There are some specific training requirements for harvest and post-harvest that workers must be trained on the PSR requirements and any tasks that are associated with those activities. And it's just good to actually use this as an opportunity to quiz them, because most of these things, or all of these things, have already been covered in previous modules. So this would be a good opportunity to, even before you show this slide, to pop up a quiz or engage your audience in some way and see if they remember what kind of requirements we've previously discussed for worker training. I love this slide because a lot of the trainings that I have done for growers, I typically have a pretty diverse audience. And I think these two discussions about different types of packing areas, open versus closed, cover a wide range of different types of packing scenarios. But if you know you're working with an entire group of apple growers, they have very large enclosed packing houses, you may choose to just focus on the closed portion where they have more control over that environment, versus something that we would call like a 4 sticks and a lid setup, where someone's maybe a smaller farm or a smaller operation and they actually have an outdoor packing area or even like a pop-up tent. I've seen some that just during the time that they're picking, they'll have those pop-up tents, kind of like you would use at a football game tailgate or something. They'll put some plastic tables out, and that will be their particular packing setup, which obviously has its different risks. So it's important to discuss those different risks depending on what type of situation and setup they're dealing with. It's also a really good time to have them get out their highlighters and take a look in the notes, because this is the first time that you'll see specific requirements related to fully versus partially enclosed buildings, and that falls into subpart L. And then also a discussion about facilities and packing areas being suitable for size and in their construction and adequate to facilitate maintenance and cleaning. So those are 2 new FSMA PSR requirements that pop up on this particular slide. I also like this particular slide because I think the photos in this, which again, you can swap out the photos to be more representative of your particular audience, but they represent things that I think a lot of growers may end up seeing in their particular packing house setups. But again, it's an opportunity to highlight some basic practices that can reduce hazards. And some of them are really basic. I mean, for the most part, most growers that I know are already doing things to manage pests. They want to have a product to sell. They want to maintain that quality. So that's a really easy sell. One thing that they might not have thought of before is standing water. What do you do about pooling water, and why is that a particular risk? That might be a new concept for them. Or things like keeping things organized. That's just, a good business practice to maintain flow of the activities, to get better efficiency out of the workers, so the workers know exactly which tools have been cleaned and sanitized. Having a little bit of organization goes a long way. Even labeling. We've done some workshops about cleaning and sanitation, and having tools labeled by color is really a useful thing to have, especially in packing houses, so that oh, this tool is only used for zone 1 food contact surfaces versus this tool, which we use to clean drains out. Definitely don't want to use this tool for zone 1. So there's a lot of ways to make this really easy for growers to organize, but you need to provide some of those examples for them. You should also take notice that in the next 2 slides of this series, we're going to introduce a new concept of establishing zones. And this may be completely unfamiliar to some growers attending your trainings. So the first thing I typically do is have them sit down with a pen and a paper or a crayon and whatever, and map out the flow of product that is coming into their packing area and then going out. And all of the items it touches, food contact surfaces it touches, people who touch it, you will be really surprised when you have growers go through that activity. They start realizing, oh, I didn't realize that that particular bumper, you know, as the melons were rolling down was contacting them. Maybe I need to be concerned about cleaning and sanitizing that particular surface. Or I didn't realize my workers were going in and out of the bathroom, not taking off their smocks. I mean, just general observations about how things are moving around the packing house is a good activity when you start to discuss why we're encouraging them to establish zones. It is really, really important here, and you'll notice, for those of you who are familiar with delivering this curriculum, there is no section symbol on this slide or on very many of the slides that follow, primarily because establishing zones is not a PSR requirement. That is specifically a best practice that we're encouraging to help them prioritize managing those risks in their particular facilities. I dropped in here just a resource that's developed by the University of Vermont team. I think it's a great resource talking about efficient and safe wash and pack areas, but this is what I'm talking about. Getting them to think about the flow of produce and people, and that also goes to ergonomics, you know, just long hours standing and washing produce. How can you make that more efficient for your workers or for their workers? Those types of things you can build into these discussions to really sell food safety beyond just food safety. A lot of these practices are efficiency things, are ergonomic things that are good practices for them to implement regardless. And Connie did just drop in that resource into the chat box. So thanks, Connie. And I also plugged University of Vermont has a bunch of other great packing house resources and a bunch of case studies that they've done too. So I would check that out on their blog as well. This is really the overview slide for introducing what those particular zones are. If you know that you have a bunch of growers who are likely don't have a formal packing house setup, maybe they're only field packing, I would not spend a ton of time on this particular slide or the slides that follow that we'll talk about that are optional. So slide 10 is really just the overview of zones. If you don't think that your audience, this is going to be relevant for your audience, I would skip slides 12, 13, and 14. Those are the ones that are optional that come after it. We do have a developed activity that is in the chat box. If you haven't used it before, it's called Name That Zone. It basically is a PowerPoint that you can also print out as nice photos. That is an engagement activity where you can show the photos on screen or pass the pictures around if you're doing an in-person training, and then have them guess, you know, which zone is this? Is this zone 1, 2, or 3? And then have a discussion. And some of that activity is actually designed to not have one right answer. So some people might consider it a zone 2, some might consider it a zone 3, but the point of the whole activity is to get their brains thinking about why we're even establishing these zones and how you would prioritize cleaning and sanitation in those particular areas. I also recognize that I just said that there are several optional slides that trainers can decide to skip, but can anybody tell me why this particular slide is not optional? If you use the chat box, why is this slide not optional? Anybody? Bueller?
Because it has the PSR requirement.
Yeah, it talks about, well, it has this section symbol in the corner, but does anybody know specifically what about the section symbol? What's new in this particular slide that we're going to talk about? Yeah, somebody just said the rule requirement for cleaning and appropriate sanitizing food contact surfaces. So if you look in the slide notes for this particular module, you'll notice that we're really getting into the content where we start discussing the requirements for 112.123, which I think is a good place to really pause and talk with your growers about, because it does require that all food contact surfaces of equipment and tools used in covered activities be inspected, maintained, cleaned when necessary and appropriate. This is going to be the challenging part. You're going to get a lot of questions about what is appropriate sanitize to protect against contamination of covered produce. So this is really the first time that we're getting into the PSR requirements for cleaning and sanitation of those surfaces, but really it's up to the grower to determine what is appropriate. And the whole reason why we've introduced this concept of zones is to help them focus those efforts on what is the most immediate thing that they should focus on to make the biggest impact on produce safety. The next few slides are optional, so I'm not going to cover the content in these slides, but basically it covers the other zones, zones 2, 3, and 4. So there's a slide for each one of those particular zones that you can get into more detail about. I typically would deliver these and then do the activity with them just so that they get a little bit more of an idea, and we discuss some of those specifics in the zones. But if you don't think it's relevant to your audience, then I would definitely consider cutting out these particular slides. If you recall the roadmap that I showed at the beginning of this presentation, this is the next transition point in this particular slide deck. So now we're moving from talking about what are the risks and identifying those risks to developing sanitation practices to reduce those risks. So slide 16 really begins this series. We're moved from risk identification to implementation. And this is just a transition slide to introduce some practices. Many growers are already doing a lot of these things, but this is a higher level summary of some practices that they might consider implementing. You also might recall that this particular slide you may have seen before. I feel like a lot of us currently living in the COVID area feel like every day we wake up and it's Groundhog Day. If anybody has not seen, there's a movie from 1993 with Bill Murray where every day he wakes up and it's the same thing over again. It's not a mistake that this particular slide shows up more than once in the curriculum. And the reason why this slide shows up more than once is because we think it is an incredibly valuable concept that a lot of growers don't understand or don't get quite right. So in module 1, your trainer should have already delivered or introduced this concept, but here's where you have the opportunity to really drive home what is cleaning and what is sanitizing and what are those particular differences. I also think that it's really helpful at this point, since they've already been introduced to the concept, instead of just reading off definitions, give them some examples of what a cleaning and sanitation step might look like. So that could be talking about making a peanut butter and jelly. You could actually get out bread, peanut butter and jelly, make a messy PB&J and talk about what do you need to remove the fats, the peanut butter from that surface? What detergent might you use to remove the carbohydrates? And then what's the next step? Do you use a sanitizer? What does the sanitizer label say? I mean, there's ways that you can make this a little more interactive, or you can tell some stories. And one story that I normally tell is called my slippery chicken story, which we can get into after hours. But the key point is that you want to give them something that really sticks in their mind going forward about why these two practices are very different and why it makes a difference to the products they're using and the actual activities that they're trying to accomplish. So these next slides are really walking through visually what a 4-step cleaning and sanitation process looks like. The key point on this particular slide that I would highlight is that the water that is, if it is being used, there are some packing facilities that may be dry cleaning in which water is not a part of their process. But the water quality for post-harvest must be no detectable generic E. coli. So that's why you see the section symbol on this slide. And then another thing to point out is you notice this person that's spraying with the hose. One thing that often doesn't get talked about, but growers sometimes like to think is a great practice, is to just get out the pressure washer. I mean, I'm just going to blast that stuff right off of there and it'll look good as new. And the issue with that is anytime you're using high pressure or high air pressure to blow off debris, what you're doing is potentially distributing that to other areas of the packing facility. So you want to encourage them to use low pressure water or air to, blow off some of those surfaces, or even just brushing off into a dustpan of some sort. So we really want to make sure that that is covered, because that's something that I often see, well, pressure washer will get that done, which is absolutely true, but it would be great if they're going to clean some piece of equipment or a table, that they take that outside of a packing area where it's not going to be a source of cross-contamination to anything else. This next one really is covering step 2, which talks about detergents. And this is really helping them to think about what types of products might be appropriate for this particular use. Are you trying to clean off fats? Are you trying to clean off carbohydrates? Or might there be some other type of soil that they might need to remove? Right now, I think this is one of the challenges. We get a lot of questions about what type of detergent should I be encouraging growers to use. And I'm just going to throw the PSA team under the bus here, but we have been talking about developing some sort of fact sheet for detergents for this particular purpose, just because there's not a lot of information out there. And this is actually one of the things that I often get questions from growers who are going through audits. What particular products should be used for this step 2. In step 3, it's just cleaning the surface with clean water. Again, that's no detectable generic E. coli water. You can reinforce, again, low pressure for that water, but this one's pretty straightforward. And then the final step is adding a sanitizer and following that label. And it's good to remind them, just like in module 5.2, where you were talking about sanitizers for post-harvest use, that the label is the law, so they need to follow the label. We say on the slide, let surface air dry, but that might not actually be part of that particular product's label. One very new concept that is not covered on the slide, but shows up in the slide notes, is this concept of clean break. And Connie just dropped in an updated resource from University of Florida. It's called Establishing a Lot Through Sanitation Clean Breaks in Produce Packing Facilities. You'll actually notice that in the slide notes, that original reference that's printed in the slide notes is from 2013. They actually just recently updated it. So that link that you're seeing in the chat box is the updated version. If you ever are concerned or you go to one of these links and it's dead, our website, we're constantly updating these links on our website. So you can always find, and someone from the PSA team can drop where those links are. You can always find the most up-to-date links on our website. And we will be making changes whenever a new version of the PSA curriculum comes out. We will update these links, but establishing a clean break is something that some growers have never heard of, don't know what the value is. So this is an opportunity to talk about what it is and why they might do it. Again, here's your next transition slide. So this is where you're moving away from those broader practices for cleaning and sanitation into more specific practices for cleaning and sanitation. And slide 22 is the transition. It also introduces a specific produce safety requirement about sanitary design of equipment. So again, here's where that 112.123 pops up about equipment and tools being adequate in design and being able to be cleaned. So this is really where you start to tiptoe into that whole world of sanitary design, which is definitely a whole topic in and of itself. But there are some basic practices that we introduce in this particular module. I think from a trainer standpoint, there is a lot of opportunity to develop specific workshops just on this topic alone about sanitary design, cleaning and sanitation. So this is really just showing them the tip of the iceberg. Additionally, in this slide is where you might have to start. Well, in this slide and the slides that follow, you might end up having to address some trickier questions. So for example, when we start talking about, oh, well, you should use non-toxic and non-absorbent surfaces, what does that mean? Am I not allowed to use wood anymore? So those are the kind of questions that you're probably going to get. starting on this slide forward, that you should be prepared to provide some other solutions. If growers are using wood, is that wood actually a risk? How are they monitoring or looking at those particular bins before they're used? Do they have any cleaning or sanitation process? So again, it's really about moving them in that progression, because when you look at the first few bullets on the slide, I always feel really weird presenting these first bullets, because we're asking them to do non-toxic, non-absorbent, durable, able to withstand corrosion, able to be easily cleaned and sanitized. And every grower in the room is probably going like, ugh, none of my things in my packing house are that. But we're not expecting them to do all of that. We're just expecting them to work with what they've got and consider transitioning to something that might be lower risk if they identify it as a risk. And this is a good place to remind them that the best case scenario is not always possible. Many farms do have old equipment or wooden equipment, and it's good to recognize and meet the growers where they're at, because I think this is where you really can start losing some of your audience, where they say, oh man, these food safety people are just nuts. They're asking me to do all these crazy things. They're asking me to get rid of all my wood surfaces. Now I have to start doing all these practices. But ultimately, all hope is not lost. You have to get them back on the train and really enforce why moving to some of these lower risk surfaces or practices is going to benefit not just food safety, but potentially the quality of their produce long term, because they're potentially covering spoilage organisms as well. So there are ways that you can sell these things that are more than just food safety. We call those the double smiley faces. For those of you who have been in packing houses before, you've likely seen some really interesting and innovative workarounds that growers have come up with. They're very resourceful by nature, and I give them a lot of credit for that. But I have seen some pieces of equipment that you're just like, that doesn't look quite right, but I see why you did it. And one case study that often comes up when we're teaching this particular slide or this concept is the 2011 outbreak with Jensen Farms. That particular operation utilized a piece of equipment that really wasn't designed for that particular purpose. If you don't want to call out a specific farm or a case study like that, you can just show some photos. Like, for example, in this particular slide, you can see there's some post-manufacturing welds. Those can be harborage sites for microorganisms. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you start getting into pieces of equipment how difficult and almost impossible it is to clean some of these spaces. So if it's not properly designed to be cleaned and sanitized, it's probably never going to be fully cleaned and sanitized. In addition, a lot of growers aren't doing this on a regular basis because their equipment is not designed for that purpose. So it's just moving them forward, not necessarily recommending that they go out and buy all new equipment. But if they are thinking about investing in a piece of new equipment, you need to be encouraging them to talk to a specialist, talk to a sanitary design person, talk to the equipment manufacturer, and ask those questions. You know, how do you clean it? Can I take it apart? That needs to be part of the conversation going forward so that they don't invest in something that could potentially actually cause more of a risk. So we also talk about how to reduce risk even before you get into the packing house. This is really talking about the environment from the field and then on through putting things into containers. And you should be prepared to address specific questions about keeping harvest containers clean during the harvest process. So for example, one thing that might come up is using or implementing a process where those containers, those picking containers or harvest containers, are not put directly on the ground, especially if they're going to be stacked on top of one another, because you could have materials falling onto the produce and contaminating it. Or I know some growers will have paper between if they are going to put them on the ground. You know, there are ways that you can reduce risk before even getting into the packing house. This is especially important going back to that content in Module 5.2. With the sanitizers, if you're bringing in a lot of organic material into that wash water, you can have a lot harder of a time managing the sanitizer level, which is why we're talking about how do you prevent it from even getting into the packing area in the first place? So with the packing area maintenance, one new PSR requirement does pop up on this slide, and it's good to note this whole thing about drip and condensation. So if you look at 112.126, it also talks about preventing contamination from floors, walls, ceilings, fixtures, ducts, pipes, and then that drip or condensate. So that is a new requirement that we haven't discussed in any of the modules previously. And it's also good to provide some examples for them of where they might encounter this. So for example, if it's a really hot, humid day, workers are in and out of the cooler all day long, not only is the cooling unit not getting down to its appropriate temperature, but maybe it's accumulating some additional moisture and that's dripping onto produce. So that's something that they should be thinking about and be cognizant of, especially because we don't want that water dripping directly onto the produce. Packing containers is really fairly straightforward, although you probably are going to get some tricky questions on this one. In fact, I just had a conversation with one of our New York educators about reused packing containers. So I know some farms really like to use those banana boxes because they're sturdy, they're waxed, they reuse very well. But I would encourage you as the trainer to have them take a look particularly at the requirements in the regulation, because it does specifically stipulate that only new single-use containers or cleaned reusable containers should be used to pack produce. So that can be a challenge. I'm not an inspector. I can't tell you how an inspector might feel about someone using a reused banana box, which in theory you could wipe out. I don't think it can be sanitized because that wax eventually gets scratched, and you could have harborage sites, probably a low risk practice. But again, you really need to go back to that language in 112.116, which talks about specifics related to packing containers and materials that produce is being packed into. Pest management is really fairly straightforward. We've talked about pests in module 4, but this is where we get more into talking about the doors and seals and traps and really knowing what your problem is, because if you don't know what the problem is, it's going to be very difficult to figure out what the solution is. So for example, a mouse trap really isn't going to work very well if the grower has a rat infestation. So getting them to think about or identify at least what their particular pest issue is and then how they might manage it. But these are things that many growers are already doing. And then the second slide, again, gets into some tips. You'll see that there are no PSR requirements on this particular slide, but plenty of best practices that they consider implementing. All right, in previous refresher sessions, we have used the annotate feature. So this is one opportunity to use those clicker questions and insert those clicker questions into your particular PowerPoint and have your audience engage, if you're doing this online, by using the annotate function. And for those of you who are familiar, feel free to participate in this little poll. But which of the following practices is a FSMA PSR requirement for pest control in buildings? If you can use your annotate and use a stamp or some other way to show, see, I just put my stamp in just to show. Put your stamp in the box of what you think the answer might be. So I'll give you a second. Looks like a lot of people are saying C. And if you haven't used, for those of you who haven't been to previous sessions, if you haven't used the annotate feature before, that actually shows up in your bar for Zoom. On Zoom, there's an annotate button. When you click that, it should pop up a bunch of different options that you can text and draw, add stamps, you can use an eraser. So this is a really great tool to use if you're doing an online training. But I think you guys got the gist of it. I just wanted to give you an example of a way to engage your audience if you haven't seen this before, I would encourage you to clear the drawings before you move on to the next slide. Otherwise, that will carry through. But you guys all got the answer right, so good job. The requirement in the PSR is that you routinely monitor for pests. There are, I believe, 3 other clicker questions that we've developed for this particular module. I'm not going to show you them just in the interest of time here, because I see I'm getting very close to the end. But that's just an example. So with cold storage areas, again, dripping condensation is something you want to highlight here. This is also where I would talk about calibration of thermometers, because that's the first place this really appears. I guess you talk a little bit about temperature control with regards to post-harvest water management, but with cooler temperatures and thermometers, there is a requirement in the PSR to have those calibrated. Ice and ice slurries, key points here to highlight would be free of detectable generic E. coli. And then also thinking about cleaning and sanitation of those ice chests. That's something that I think is often overlooked. You go on any farm that has an ice cooler or an ice chest and ask, when was the last time you cleaned this thing? I can pretty much guarantee that they say, ooh, never, or maybe last year. So having those bins that are storing ice cleaned and sanitized on a regular basis is a good practice. Transportation considerations. This could range a whole bunch of different types of transport depending on the growers that you're working with or who are attending your course. Everything from a wooden buggy to a semi trailer with a reefer unit attached. So you're going to see a lot of different types of transport. One thing that you might want to point out here that you might get questions on is the FSMA Sanitary Transportation Act, which actually farms are exempt from that particular rule, but any vehicle used to harvest, pack, or hold covered produce must be kept clean and sanitary. Connie did drop in the link to that particular part of FSMA, but again, it doesn't apply to farms. But for those that are doing other types of training or PC trainings, that might be something that you might want to discuss with your audience. Inspecting vehicles is also something, again, this is not anything that's a PSR requirement, but there are a lot of best practices that growers should be implementing. Here is where I provide some examples of, what do you do if you open the door and it smells really strongly of something nasty or even something like coffee? Maybe they're trying to cover up an off odor. That is something that might tip off a grower like, ooh, maybe there was something that is just nasty in this that needs to be cleaned out. Another thing to think about, and we'll get into this with the physical risks, is I have had a grower who had a lot of apples that was rejected by a baby food manufacturer because of wooden splinters that were in the bottom of the floor, presumably from wood bins or something else that the truck was hauling. And the baby food manufacturer wasn't willing to take that product because of that physical hazard. So that's another reason why they want to be vigilant on inspecting vehicles. SOPs, as usual, are a very handy tool. They're not a requirement of the produce safety rule, but especially in this module, I think it's quite overwhelming for growers when you start thinking about all of these practices that they might need to implement. But there are templates out there, everything from pests to cleaning and sanitizing. SOPs especially are useful, so you make sure that the workers are doing it properly. And I always encourage trainers to talk about, if you're going to develop an SOP, have that grower actually ask the worker, hey, go and do all of these steps. I'm going to watch you and just see if you did it right or if I need to tweak that particular SOP. Here are the slides where we get into everything beyond microbial risk. So we've already talked a lot about microbial risk in the first few modules. But here's your opportunity to engage the audience about chemical hazards, which again are not part of the produce safety rule, but we know are something that often creep into the packing house environment because they might be storing chemicals or lubricants or other types of hazardous products in or around those areas. And then the next slide is talking about physical risks, things like wood or glass. I mean, those are things that they also need to be considering in terms of their operation. The next two slides really just highlight corrective actions. There are a number of things that you could discuss on these particular slides. I think stories are a great way of discussing this particular content. And if people are willing, I think this slide and this next slide are good places for growers to share an experience if they're willing to do so. Some might not be so proud that their septic backed up into their packing house, but I think those are opportunities, if they're willing to share, to have other growers hear what happened and then how they fixed that particular problem. And then the record keeping. So the required record keeping, sorry, one slide too fast there. The only record that's required that's unique to this particular module is the record for cleaning and sanitation of tools, equipment, and containers. We discussed a whole lot of other practices where it would be beneficial to have records, such as with pest management, worker training, and SOPs. Obviously, that's a required record. If there are practices that the workers are being trained on, we talked about that in Module 2. So the only new required record that shows up here is for cleaning and sanitation. And interestingly, this data comes from the on-farm readiness review evaluation data. And this particular question is from, I think, 1,147 farms. 541 farms indicated that post-harvest sanitation was a priority area for them. And interestingly enough, inadequate record keeping of cleaning and sanitation practices was the #1 issue that was reported during those on-farm readiness reviews, which seems like a fairly easy thing to implement, but many growers aren't doing that. So if there's one place that you spend time in this module, it might be discussing or giving them templates for cleaning and sanitation, because this is one of the areas that's been identified as lacking in terms of post-harvest management. And then finally, you've made it through all 41 of the Module 6 slides. This is your opportunity to kind of wrap things up. I usually try to remind them that this whole module is about a progression. It's not going to happen overnight. Pick the top 3 things that they want to improve upon and start there. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up Module 6